Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Guide. Tonight's show is about food addiction. I am your host, Reha, and with me, Dr. D, an expert in managing health behavior. In today's news, addiction and chemistry. Bet you can't eat just one, as the old potato chip commercial had it, is of course a bet most of us end up losing. But why? Is it simple lack of willpower that makes fatty snacks irresistible, or are deeper biological forces at work? Some intriguing new research suggests the latter. Scientists in California and Italy reported last week that in rats given fatty foods, the body immediately began to release natural marijuana-like chemicals in the gut that kept them craving more. The findings are among several recent studies that add new complexity to the obesity debate, suggesting that certain foods set off powerful chemical reactions in the body and the brain. Yes, it's still true that people gain weight because they eat more calories than they burn, but those compulsions may stem from biological systems over which the individual has no control. In the recent rat studies by a team for the University of California, Irvine, and the Italian Institute of Technology in Genoa, the goal was to measure how taste alone affects the body's response to food. Among rats given liquid diets high in fat, sugar, or proteins, the ones who got the fatty liquid had a striking reaction. As soon as it hit their taste buds, their digestive systems began producing endocannabinoids, chemicals similar to those produced by marijuana use. The compounds serve a variety of functions, including regulation of mood and stress response, appetite, and movement of food through the body. Notably, they were released only when the rat tasted fat, not the sugar or protein. The findings were published online last week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The question is whether some people are born more responsive to certain foods, or whether a lifetime of overeating leads to brain and body changes that promote a stronger food response. To shed light on that issue, several studies looked at normal weight teenagers who have obese parents and as a result are at risk for becoming obese themselves. We're interested in whether the brain is responding differently even before teenagers become obese. But just because your brain is being hijacked, that doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to protect yourself. And now a word from our sponsor.
One astronomy tidbit most people seem to know is their sun sign. As viewed from the Earth, the sun passes in front of 13 constellations, not 12, during the course of 1 year. This path of the sun is called the ecliptic. The ecliptic runs exactly along the middle of the zodiac constellations and the 13th constellation named Ophiuchus, or the Serpent Bearer. When the sun sign system was set up more than 2,000 years ago, the sun's path was divided into 12 equally spaced signs. This simplification is the result of early astronomers' dislike of the number 13. Superstitions about the number 13 have been with us for thousands of years and still persist today. Claiming that there are only 12 constellations is similar to maintaining the Earth is flat. The sun is in front of the stars of Ophiuchus during the first half of December. About 1 person in 20 is an Ophiuchus, but few of them know it. Although overlooked by the zodiac, Ophiuchus, or the serpent bearer, is the god of medicine and always shown with a staff with a serpent around it. Star dials showing the 13 constellation boundaries are available in our store and also on eBay.
Welcome back to The Guide. Tonight's show is about food addiction. I'm your host, Reha, and with me I have Dr. D, an expert in managing health behavior. If you have questions for me, please ask them by calling 347-237-5379. So the question we're going to look at tonight is, what is compulsive eating and how is compulsive eating considered an addiction? What defines an eating disorder as an addiction? Although there has been some controversy as to whether anyone can be addicted to food, be a food active, or manifest the symptoms of addiction with respect to the other eating disorders such as anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder, criteria appearing in the Diagnostic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association for any and all addictions and dependency. And so I thought it might be interesting to look at this list and try to determine if it does apply to food as an addiction. The first criteria is tolerance. So, Dr. D, perhaps you can help us here. Is there such a thing as a tolerance with food addiction?
Sure, Reha, that's a great question. We know through research that we see levels of tolerance with different types of substance use. So if we're speaking of alcohol or marijuana or even cocaine, we know that as an individual continues to use a substance, that their level of tolerance goes up. What does that mean? What that means is that when we initially start utilizing the substance and our body's not used to that substance, we have a certain feeling or effect that's related to the way the substance interacts with the chemicals of the body. But we also know that's true with food. When we take sugar, for example, if we're not big on eating a lot of sugar and we first take sugar and ingest it in our body, sometimes that gives us a feeling of uneasiness or irritability. Some people even report feeling tightness in the chest or tingling sensations in their hand. But the more sugar they consume, the less likely they are to feel those same physiological responses, and less they continue to consume more and more sugar, thus the tolerance. As we become more accustomed to the substance, the body requires more of the substance in order to get the same feeling or effect from that substance. Whether it's a drug, whether it's food, you can see an increase in tolerance.
So according to this concept of tolerance, food can create a chemical dependency in a person and also a chemical sensitivity to a certain substance, even though these substances are necessary for life and not necessarily harmful drugs.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we're not necessarily talking about the same kind of effect that a substance like cocaine or marijuana or alcohol do, but they still are, a substance that we can develop a tolerance to, and that over a period of time it does have an unhealthy impact on the body, because we know as the more that we eat, the more calories that we consume, typically we start to gain weight, and over a period of time that excess weight can lead to chronic disease and illness, such as heart disease, high blood pressure. We're now even seeing research that associates, body weight with different types of cancer.
Mm-hmm. And so, of course, this brings us to the next criteria, and that is the unsuccessful effort to cut back or control. If food acts as a chemical on the brain and creates an addiction, that means that the very organ that we need to make a decision with about whether or not to cut back or control this substance is impacted. And thus, as with drugs, some people are unsuccessful in their efforts to cut back or control foods that are high in sugar or fat.
Yeah, that's true. What we know is that the prefrontal cortex of the brain is really responsible for handling all of the executive function. So that includes things like planning, organizing, making choices, and being creative, as well as reigning in impulsivity, impatience, and irritability. So we know that when we are eating various different foods for various different reasons, that they're going to stimulate that prefrontal cortex of the brain. And, of course, that stimulation of the brain also leads to the release of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that motivates us to seek additional reward. And in this case, additional reward is more food. So if we continue to reward ourselves with more and more food, we need more and more reward, which can lead to that addiction.
Mm-hmm. So would you agree that one significant symptom of addiction is the time an addict will spend to obtain or recover from the effects of perhaps eating too much?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, sometimes the amount of time or the amount of time required to recover does become longer for many people as they become more addicted to a food. So, for example, if somebody has developed a habit and an addiction to eating chocolate cake, the ability to break that addiction and change that behavior is going to require a longer amount of time, and it's going to be a more difficult effort for them to do such.
This sounds like bad news for chocolate lovers. I don't like it. And so, additional ways that food addiction manifests itself is through symptoms such as decreased activities due to dependency, maybe less desire to exercise, spending more time in front of the television, and also in spite of the negative consequences associated with these symptoms, they seem to persist and continue despite these negative consequences.
Yeah, and listen, the reason that we see that is because food doesn't just provide a negative consequence. There's also a positive consequence. We utilize food as a coping mechanism. Many of us do that on a regular basis. We have a hard day at work. We're stressed out about a relationship. And one of the things that we can do is we can eat. We're capable of controlling what we consume. Many of the foods that we consume produce a certain emotional response for us, makes us feel better. And so it's utilized as a coping mechanism. And if that becomes our primary coping mechanism, it's very easy to fall into a habitual pattern of utilizing foods to cope with daily stressors. Over a period of time, that then starts to develop more of an addictive pattern.
Mm-hmm. So what is interesting to me is to note that per APA guidelines, one need only demonstrate 3 of the above criteria in a span of 12 months to meet the criteria for addiction or dependency. What you might ask yourself, listener, or someone suffering with an eating disorder is whether the above criteria can be applied to your relationship with food or dieting and exercise. When polled, virtually all of the residents in certain recovery groups recognized a minimum of 5 or 6 of the criteria we discussed, more than the minimum 3 required to describe dependency. In addition, those polled varied in flavor of disorder, covering the full spectrum of eating disorders. And with that, we need to take a station break. We will be right back with more information about food addiction. Welcome back to The Guide. Tonight's show is about food addiction. I'm your host, Reha, and with me, Dr. Z. He is an expert in managing health behaviors. What most people associate with addictions is a compulsive behavior. So really the question for me is, what is compulsive overeating? Is it a psychological illness? And can the addict be called a sufferer?
Yeah, no, compulsive overeating is not necessarily a psychological illness. Typically, we have a tendency, as we spoke of earlier in the show, Reha, to get into compulsive behaviors as a form of coping mechanism. And as we start to utilize a specific coping mechanism, we can become compulsive with those behaviors to help address things that might be problematic or difficult situations that we're facing in our life.
Yeah. So for a food addict, the solution is maybe a food plan to abstain from those foods that cause them to overeat. But food, unlike drugs, is necessary in life, and it is all around us. It is not illegal. I find it difficult to imagine that an individual will realistically be able to abstain from those foods that are harmful forever. What can a person do that has difficulty with overeating?
Yeah, well, first of all, we can look at any food and we can say that most foods, if in moderation, aren't harmful. So if we're choosing to eat sugary snacks or very salty, fatty snacks, as long as we're eating those foods in moderation, they're not harmful to the body. The real question becomes, what is moderation? And how much is moderation based on an individual's perspective? And then are they using certain types of food as a coping mechanism? So what an individual really needs to be looking at is if they find themselves consuming a specific type of food, if they're going out of their way to get that food. So, for example, at 10:30 at night, if you're making a trip to the local convenience store to pick up chocolate Cocoas or Twinkies, and you're doing that on a very regular basis, you're starting to see a pattern with a specific type of food you can consume for a number of potential different reasons. So one of the things that we do that can be helpful is limit that food source within the home. So if you know that you have a weakness or compulsion to a certain food, try not to purchase that and keep it in the home. Make it a food that you literally have to go out of your way in order to get it. What we know is that if it is something that's more inconvenient, we're less likely to actually go out and purchase and try to get that food for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's great. How do processed foods play a role in food addiction? For instance, is sugar considered to be a processed food? After all, it comes from sugar cane. What can be more natural? We consider, potato chips to be a processed food because they contain additional fats and sugars that are not normally found in potatoes. But is sugar considered to be a processed food? And that's something that we need to stay away from on that basis.
We can look at various different forms of sugar. Table sugar, which is called sucrose, is a processed form of sugar. It's not sugar in the raw. But regardless of what type of sugar that we're using, whether we're using sugar in the raw or we're using like a white sugar or a processed sugar, a table sugar, what it does is it actually increases the amount of insulin that's produced in the body. And we get what's called a sugar high. So that sugar high a lot of times makes us feel better. It lifts our spirit. It gives us more energy. But it's an immediate effect. Usually within 10 to 15 minutes, we start to feel that lift or that a boost of energy, if you will. But over a period of time, we're gonna find that insulin's going to drop, and that energy spike is going to drop, and we're going to start to feel kind of lethargic or tired. Well, what do? When we start to feel lethargic or tired, we actually start to want more of that sugar in order to get that energy boost or that lift back. And so we go through the day cycling through high levels of energy, low levels of energy, and in order to get that energy back, instead of doing something more natural like going for a walk or boosting our energy through exercise, we consume sugar, which helps us create kind of a pseudo-energy, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And of course, many people would wonder if illnesses such as anorexia nervosa are considered to be part of this category of food addiction illnesses. Is anorexia nervosa a food illness?
No. Anorexia nervosa or bulimia is not considered a food illness. Those are body methoric disorders. But they just so happen to focus around food because the amount of food that we eat or the amount that we don't eat can actually help reshape or reposition weight on the body. So having a food addiction is very different than having something like anorexia nervosa or bulimia.
Okay. That's right. Okay. And now a break and a word from our sponsors.